getting machines to make those kinds of judgment calls?
I think progress can be made. So first of all, what is happening now is many products have a section which is human curated and also a section which is machine curated. So Apple News is a good example of this, right? They've got their sort of editor's picks, and then they've got their sort of personalized for you section. I'm not suggesting that we replace all of the human editors with machines. What I am suggesting is that personalization could actually be really valuable. What a school teacher needs is going to be different than what a pharmacist needs in terms of the types of information that is important for them to hear. And I think we can make progress. So there's a few different directions that people have looked at. One is for the journalists to add more information. So the Swedish Broadcasting Corporation requires their journalists, when they file a story, to add some metadata. In particular, what is the level of importance of the story? So from, oh, it's kind of interesting, but not really critical, to this affects all of the country or the world and everybody should read it. And also what topic it's on, and also what the timeliness of the story is. Is this something that's still going to be interesting to read tomorrow or even next week or not? And so they add this type of information to try to help the algorithm make these decisions. Where should I put this? How long should someone see it? And then another technique is to simply ask people, was this story or this set of stories informative? So you can ask your users, instead of trying to figure out what they think by looking at what they click on, you can use surveys. And there's ongoing research to try to figure out how to use the answers to these types of surveys to drive the algorithm. The idea is, okay, these are machine learning algorithms. They can learn to optimize for a specific reaction. Instead of training them to optimize for, did someone click on it? Let's train them to optimize for, when we asked them, the audience said it was useful to them. So these are the types of techniques that are now under investigation.
Encourage everybody in the different cities and online, please to send through questions and points that you'd like us to pick up. I've got a few already in my feed, and I'll get to as many of them as we can. I do want to talk about bias in algorithms, David. Perhaps just talk to us about why algorithms are susceptible to bias, and perhaps what we can do about it.
Yeah, sure. So it's kind of builds partly on what Jonathan was just saying about how computers need to be taught explicitly about what human values are. I think the way a lot of AI works is that a set of data is collected, examples, often with labels on them, of behavior that you want the system to produce. And then the AI basically learns from those examples and will try to recreate the behavior that those examples somehow encapsulate. So for example, if you're looking at what stories are worth investigating as a journalist or as a fact checker, what people have done is to collect published fact checks and compare those with claims that were never checked. And so, well, clearly this is decisions that fact checkers made, and therefore we should just reproduce that behavior and build an AI algorithm which can predict correctly which stories were checked, which ones were not checked by fact checkers. And the problem is, of course, that the choice of what to check is actually very, very complex. It's based on, would the story be interesting to our readers? Is the claim actively harmful or merely misleading? And so the data they have is not necessarily actually representative of the thought processes of the journalists that made the decisions as to what to publish and what not to publish. And so but you end up with this sort of bias towards what happened to be readily available data. So I think that when you train the system from data, there's always a risk that you bias the system towards, like I said, recreating the behavior captured in the data. And therefore we need to be very consciously aware of that as you do AI, and monitor what kind of biases were in the data. How was data created? How did you sample from reality to create this data set? And were the biases in there? So for example, one thing I'm aware of doing natural language processing, when we take text from someone like Hansard, the UK parliamentary record, it's very, very nicely written. In a certain sort of style, but it's very, very clear English. It's been edited for clarity. So every sentence is fully constructed, and there's no slang, there's no swearing. It's very nice, clear, pure English. if you take the same content from, say, Facebook or Twitter, it's much more natural. It's how people actually talk, and therefore there's much more slang, abbreviations, memes, jokes, and so on. And so systems trained on one set of data may not work so well on a different set of data. And if you're not aware of that, you may end up sort of over-checking or over-analyzing certain people who you can understand. Not because they're worth paying attention to, but merely because your system happens to be capable of interpreting and understanding their text. So another sort of classic example of this was the YouTube has offering that if you upload a video to YouTube, they can automatically add a closed caption subtitles to it. And if you speak with a Southern California accent, it works really well. If you speak with a Scottish accent, it produces basically garbage because the system just wasn't trained to recognize Scottish accents, even if they're speaking English. So yeah, these are all biases which, unless someone identifies them and calls them out, tend to just build up and go live. And there have been numerous cases of AI algorithms which have turned out after being deployed and widely used, someone's gone through the results more carefully and said, actually, these ones are massively racist or sexist or homophobic, and no one's noticed. And this is a big problem. And I'm very conscious here, speaking as a straight white man, that a lot of these systems are developed by straight white men in California and in London and elsewhere, and can show bias against people from other groups, which we need to be basically paying more attention to.
Would I be correct to try to capture that by saying that there are assumptions about what is normal, which are built into the ways in which data gets captured, that are dangerous, that one has to interrogate and look at? Would that be a fair way of putting it?
Yes, I think that's much clearer than what I actually said. So yes, I think there is this bias towards normality as represented by the data you're sampling. And the risk is that people with the loudest voices tend to get oversampled. Their opinions, their way of speaking will be overrepresented in the data, and the AI just reflects whatever it's being given. It's not smart enough to think, well, perhaps there's something else I should be looking at. It just works with whatever it is given.
There are issues of language there that you raise, which I'd also like to come back to. But it seems to me that what you're saying is that a lot of the dangers are in the data selection. I wonder to what extent, particularly when you have very large data sets, there are also issues of privacy that one has to worry about. I mean, I was thinking about it when we were hearing about the Pandora's Papers yesterday. I mean, there's every chance that somewhere in those documents there is personal information on people that are completely innocent, really, and of no journalistic interest at all. What should we be doing around privacy issues in large data sets of that sort? David?
Yeah, it's a massive problem. I think when I was starting out as an AI researcher back sort of 20, 30 years ago now, a large data set would have like thousands of records, which meant you could read through all of the data sets in a spreadsheet in one go, and you can know what was there. Nowadays, people scrape the web and they end up with data sets literally with millions of articles or millions of pictures, millions of videos, and no one person ever sees all of them, so that you don't know what's actually in there. And this is a risk. So there's a set created recently by some academics, look at images actually rather than text. I was like the biggest collection ever of images, which they scraped from the web without any sort of proper curation. And so it turns out when someone actually analysed this, that there were, I'm not sure the exact figures now, but we're talking tens of thousands of images in there, which were quite extreme pornography, including some which is non-consensual stuff, and really sort of stuff inappropriate for that kind of collection. And I think certain with big text data sets have been used for training a lot of the kind of AI models that I rely on, have been generated with text that's been scraped blindly and no one's ever checked it. So partly there's a bias there towards, like I said, the loudest voices. So if you start scraping Reddit, lots of text there is great, but most of it is created by men aged 18 to 30, and most of it in America. So there's a bias there. And yeah, you don't know what information they're putting there. Anything could be private, either their own private information they're sharing to, they think, a few friends, which then gets scraped, picked up in some huge collection and shared globally, or else people sharing other people's private information without permission. And again, that can then get scraped and amplified and built into these models. So I think it is a challenge, and I don't know the correct answer, apart from just being very conscious and deliberate when creating data, have a bigger data set you want, to actually verify that what you've got is what you think you've got, that it's not biased unduly, doesn't contain private data, And that does mean, yeah, it may be more expensive, maybe slower to collect those data sets. But I think that's necessary to avoid privacy breaches and unwanted biases in data.
Language, right? I mean, a lot of this is focused on and makes use of and relies on English and a particular kind of standard English that, you know, is actually restricted to quite a small group of people. I mean, in Africa, we have, I don't know what the number is. I remember looking it up a little while ago, but we have a phenomenal number of languages. Is there a problem there, an ethical problem, that when we are applying AI tools and techniques that we're leaving out people who speak other languages?
Yeah, I think it is a big issue. I think historically, a lot of this research has been done in America and some in the UK as well, primarily English-speaking people. And so people like me, I'm afraid I only speak English. I tend to build these tools and test them in English. And, oh yeah, this is working fine. And think, oh, hang on, there's 5,000 other languages out there widely spoken, along with many dialects of English, which may have very different vocabularies, even different grammars. And then they need to be sort of, you know, considered at least. So tools I create, which work well on Hansard, do they work so well on newspapers coming out of Nigeria, for example? That they should do, that they're available to Africa Check, but whether they work as well is an issue. I think there has been more awareness of this recently. To the professor, Emily Bender, who's done a lot of work, sort of just basically complaining repeatedly that when people say, oh, we've got this AI tool that deals with this bit of language, if they mean English, we should just say it only works in English, and just be clear about where these things do and don't work. And AI can also sometimes be the solution. You know, I think one of the biggest advances in recent natural language processing over the last 5 years or so has been machine translation. There are now algorithms out there, more or less freely available, which can translate between multiple languages. So which can open up, you know, resources between people who otherwise wouldn't be able to communicate directly. So I think, you know, there's good news there as well. But I think people like me, technologists, have to make sure that we do push our tools out there. And yeah, our tool works in English. We have versions of it working in Spanish, French, and Portuguese, I think. I'm currently working with an intern who's trying to translate the data into Hindi. So we should have a Hindi fact-checking tool. And you know, I'm very proud of that kind of work, but it's still only scratching the surface.
I'd like to bring Adebayo into this conversation. Is this something that worries you as somebody from this continent, the language issue? Is it something, are you aware of attempts to make some of these tools more multilingual?
Thanks so much, Franz. And I appreciate what David just mentioned about trying to be more inclusive in their own approach as developers of technology. Franz, you were mentioning, you were trying to remember how many languages we have on the continent. We have about 2,000 languages on the African continent. And many times for technology developers, David, feel free to counter this, but for some, it might be in terms of what's more prudent. I remember speaking to a developer of an application the other time, and they were trying to. I was trying to talk to them about what they needed to build in terms of what would work for communities who were trying to document human rights abuses. And he was straight, told me that he would only go that route if they would be able to make some sort of profit out of it, because they had bills to pay. And so for many technological companies, they would want to look at what is in there for them, what is the benefit at the end of the road for them. But that is not sustainable in a world where we are all interconnected, and we have to look beyond what makes most business sense in every step that we take, because there are real lives being impacted as a result of this. So clearly, we have at Witness spotted and realized there's constantly a gap when the solutions are being proffered, even from the global north to the global south. There isn't always a full inclusion at that stage. It's always perceived that the technological problems are only supposed to be, the solutions are supposed to be proffered for those in the global north. And then it's an afterthought for us to include the global south. But we are as much impacted here in the global south as much as those in the global north. So whether it's in terms of the languages English should not just be an immediate go-to, or French. We have a lot of people on the continent who speak the Hausa language and the Yoruba language. And there's something that it does when people are inclusive. I recall a recent, well, not so recent, but there was a campaign that was done that involved David Beckham and included the use of AI. It was this app called Synthesia that was used to mimic his voice in the different languages, as many as over 10 languages. And he incorporated African languages in that campaign. And it resonated with a lot of people because people could relate and could identify, okay, this is David Beckham. He was not just speaking English, he was also addressing and speaking to them in the languages that they could understand. I picked the Yoruba language from that campaign, and that was very different and unique. And for that reason, even that campaign had a lot more impact. And so that is something that, developers should also consider. And it's not just in terms of language, it's also in terms of the gender bias. We have to acknowledge that sometimes we must step out of our own bubbles and really be more inclusive in our approaches. We have to be deliberate about it. It wouldn't just happen. We have to be intentional about it for it to become a theme.
Very much. I've got two questions here. The one is from Roy, who asks in what ways AI is currently being used in newsrooms. I think we've gone over some of that. I've heard you say that it's being used to analyze very large data sets. It's being used to understand better what audiences want. It's being used to a limited extent to write routinized stories. And then there are many other things that you've raised, but these are some of the elements. So I don't think we'll go over that again in any detail. But there is a question here from Solomon Tabor via Wova. What should be done in the future to introduce AI to the youth? Adebayo, do you want to pick that up? What should be done to introduce AI to the youth? Indeed, should we? Is that a thing that we should be focusing on?
I don't think that is inevitable, Franz, in terms of introducing AI to the youth. I think the youth are already caught up or are catching up, as a matter of fact. Technology cannot be stopped. It's constantly evolving. What we should rather focus on is how we can be responsible about the technology that has been developed. And when we commercialize or make it more democratized, how to make sure that we are ensuring that it's not going to be used for the wrong reasons. For every form of technological development or artificial intelligence that is being churned out, there is always a potential negatively. And so even when you think about social media, how many companies are turning out image processing filters, initially to just somewhat fun and harmless, just brighten your face and those kinds of things. But now we're getting into the realm of it potentially being able to swap your face with like reface. And that's not to put reface on the spot, but we do have applications like that are very accessible to everybody, that it could use somebody else's face on some other person's face. And we've seen this being used to harm people and swap out faces. Some use it overwhelmingly for fun, but we have seen cases where it's being used to harm individuals, and overwhelming number of those individuals have been women being placed in non-consensual images and such instances. That's the impact that this could have. And so as technology is being developed and being, of course, inevitably introduced to young people, we should also learn that there will have to be ethics to be complied with. Companies should engineer as part of their structure things that could help reverse such harms, or at least guard against the misuse of their technology and their applications. And maybe just as a final note to mention that one of the other ways we've seen, to the question that you asked earlier, one of the ways we've also seen AI being used in media houses in Africa is for image processing. But again, that is not yet perfected. And we've unfortunately seen that people's images are sometimes miscontextualized, and publications have been made only to be retracted because they were the wrong images that were used, whereas somebody else was meant to be put out there.
We lost you a little bit, but I think we got the gist of it, and I'm sorry I cut across you. At a moment there was a pause. I thought you'd finished the point. But what I was saying, Adebayo, is it sounds like some of what you're talking about is really about literacy. about understanding what is trustworthy that you see, understanding the pitfalls of what can be made up, these new ways in which content can basically be invented. Is that something we should be paying attention to? Is equipping people to read better, to read more clearly and discern what is trustworthy?
You hit the nail right on the head, Franz. Media literacy is actually at the core of something that we're currently engaged with at Witness, and that is also an offshoot of some of the conversations we have had at convenings in South Africa, for instance, in 2019, in Malaysia, and other places where we've gotten feedback on the need to increase media literacy. And I don't think media literacy is something we can ever stop harping on, because the tech is evolving as well. So for us, many times as we have a new advancement in technology, there would need to be some new media literacy to inform people about that. People need to read more. People need to be exposed to the techniques and the tactics that's being used out there, and how they could be vanguards of truth, and not to be people who help to fuel or spread misinformation or harmful information that could incite violence or cause human rights violations.
Thanks very much. And we don't have a great deal of time left, but we do have some time. If you have got questions, either here in Johannesburg in the room, or in Dakar, Abuja, Addis or Nairobi, please do send those questions through. We'd be delighted to draw you into the conversation. Jonathan, I want to pick up on a point that Adebayo raised and see what your sense is of this. The business question, right? I mean, money is being put into developing these tools. Is it money well spent in the end? I mean, we are sitting in a situation where a lot of people are outside the information ecosystem. We're sitting in a situation where journalism is facing a real business crisis. Shouldn't we be spending the money elsewhere, in places where perhaps, to create more jobs or something of that sort?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And as someone who's spent almost 10 years building open source tools for investigative journalism, it's something that I think about a lot. Because whenever I got a grant, my standard was, am I spending this money better than just giving it to a reporter? So I think that's the standard. I've heard it said that AI doesn't really make anything new possible in journalism. It just makes it cheaper. So if that's true, then we should be thinking about what's the cost effectiveness. These tools are supposed to make it possible to move through and investigate huge volumes of data that we simply wouldn't have the time or the money as journalists to do otherwise. So that's sort of the barrier, right? Can I solve this problem better by just hiring people to do it, or do I want a machine to do it? And if it's possible to make a machine to do it, that doesn't mean that you hire fewer people. It means that you can get more work done. And in fact, studies of what actually happens when newsrooms use more AI technology confirm that this is what happened. For example, when the Associated Press started using software to write business and sports stories, they didn't fire their business and sports editors. They just were able to cover far more games and far more companies. When every quarter, when earnings comes out, they now file a story on 3,000 different companies. That wasn't something that they could do with their small team of business reporters. So I think you're exactly right. The cost efficiency question is key. Personally, rather than story writing or even some of the sort of advanced data analysis that I was talking about earlier, I am most optimistic about increasing the efficiency of journalists earlier in the process, at the data cleaning process. If you're a data journalist, now you're thinking, yes, I know this problem. Data cleaning and preparation can be half or sometimes as much as 80% of the work on a story. So for example, if you get two databases, you get corporate records from an official company database, you get a list of people involved in the documents that you have, maybe from entity extraction, and now you have to match them to each other, right? Is this company this company? And it sounds fairly simple for a human to do, but it's actually quite a difficult thing. many companies and many people have the same names. You have to check the address or the date of birth. You have to use sort of common sense knowledge to figure out if they're talking about the same thing. This process is called record linkage. It's one of the slow parts of preparing data for reporting. And it's something that there are now machine learning tools to accelerate. So as a technology developer, I'm always looking for what's the slow thing that we can make a machine do, because I want to make each individual journalist able to produce more ambitious stories with the same amount of resources.
Thank you very much. I think we're getting very close to the end of the session, and I'm told we have to keep very precisely to time. We've covered a lot of ground. There are obviously, we still need, I think, all of us to get our heads around all the different ways in which AI can assist. And arising from that, I think we need to give some thought to what it means to use this incredibly useful tool responsibly. I was wanting to talk about ethical codes. I mean, very quickly, if any of you are aware of ethical codes that deal with AI issues, perhaps just throw those into the conversation. Anyone that we can refer people to? Or
I could just quickly mention that I'm aware that the African Commission on Human and People's Rights is looking at the impact that technology is going to have on human rights on the continent. And they did pass a resolution April this year, honestly, to actually look into things like artificial intelligence, what impact it will have on jobs, what impact it will have on human rights. And that is something that we are looking forward to seeing the outcome of at Witness, because then it would also fit into policy and how the African Union responds to this very growing problem on the continent. I'm also aware that there are other platforms and companies like Adobe, like Twitter, like Google, that are working on a content authenticity infrastructure initiative, which Witness is also helping work on. And that is meant to be a set of to ensure that what these companies are doing in terms of their technology does not cause more harm and does the most good. There are a ton of initiatives, even at the European level, European Union, but there's not enough time to be able to share that because we're out of time. But I would encourage people to go and look up some of them further.
Thank you very much. I'd also refer you to Charlie Beckett's piece, a report from the London School of Economics. You'll find it online, which is very useful. I want to thank the panelists. Thank you for a most interesting discussion. It's obviously a discussion that will continue for some time. Thank you, David Corney from Full Fact, Jonathan Stray from the Center for Human Compatible AI, and Adebayo Okeowo from Witness. It's been most interesting. There is a 15-minute break. And then we will convene in separate sessions in Addis on making investigative journalism sustainable, in Dakar, Wana Data Online Harassment Support Group, here in Johannesburg, how do we turn our exposés into prosecutions, in Nairobi on earth crimes, and in Abuja on spaces for women in investigative journalism. Thank you very much. It's been an interesting afternoon. Enjoy the rest of the day. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you again, Adebayo. Nice to meet you, David.